Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part 4 of an ongoing series discussing software updates in Configuration Manager 2012, specifically focused on the client side. So what I want to do today is basically walk through the client side experience of installing software updates. There's no way I can cover every possible experience, but I want to at least give a feel for how things work on the client, what the user or the admin might experience on the client side. So the first thing I want to do is talk about some of the components of software updates, the choices you can make that will impact the user's experience and the software update deployment environment. Then I want to walk through a couple of basic deployments. So one targeted at the system but optional, and the user has to initiate it. Another one that's required, and just see how those look, how they respond, and so on. And then go through some advanced deployment techniques, and then we'll wrap it up from there and look forward to the next session where we'll do some deep dive under the covers to see how all this works together. So in terms of the components, what I really want to do is focus on a few areas. So I want to start with reports, even though it's at the bottom, and because that's really pivotal to doing any kind of testing or so with software updates. Then I want to walk through the client side agent settings that can impact the experience, talk about maintenance windows, and look at Software Center, some state messages, and so on. Okay, so let's just go into the demo environment and we'll take a look. Oops, back up here, and we'll take a look. So in terms of the user experience on software updates, there are a few settings that can apply. So as I mentioned, let's start with reporting, because this is pivotal for any kind of test environment. So for example, if I want to know what software updates are applicable to a given system so that I can test them, right? Because you can't just deploy any software update to the environment and have it actionable on a system. You actually have to pick one that is required by the system so that you can deploy it, have it show up, and then you can work with it and see the results and so on. So the best way to find what software updates are applicable to the system would be by running one of the compliance reports. So compliance 5 is actually pretty useful for that. So I can look for a specific computer, what software updates are necessary, and I'll just pick one of my lab machines here. Just pick this one. Hit OK, and we can view the report. And we'll come back and see all of the status for the various updates, what's necessary, what's installed, and so on. So I'll just sort by is required and sort the other way, and I can see a number of these software updates that are required. So if I were to pick any of those that are required, then I would expect to be able to go in and deploy those and have them show up and let me be able to work with them and so on, right? Only a few of them have I actually deployed, but there's a whole slew of them that I could deploy. And so this is a really good starting place if you're trying to set up some testing for software updates in the lab. All right, so while we're in the console, let's look at a couple of other settings that would impact the user experience or the way that software updates get deployed on clients. So we'll start we'll just use default client settings. We'll start in the computer agent node and work our way down. So this is for the computer agent for sure, but these settings will apply, some of them, to software updates. So for example, this one, disable deadline randomization. Okay, so this setting is disabled by default. It's a little bit odd to have it say disable deadline randomization. Yes, that makes you think the policy is enabled, and the policy actually is enabled, but the policy says don't do the deadline randomization. So a little bit weird way to represent it, but still. Deadline randomization simply means that if I deploy an update, say today, and tell it to go into a required state with a deadline of tomorrow at 2 p.m. When tomorrow at 2 p.m. hits, if that update has not been deployed, the system will go ahead and deploy it at that time because 2 p.m. tomorrow is the deadline. The challenge with that is on virtual systems, right? So the default is to not randomize the deadline. But on virtual systems, say you have a VM host and a number of VMs on that system, if all of those virtual systems hit the deadline at the exact same time, then you could have a fair load being put on the host while we churn through the software update application. So one of the options that we give you is to randomize that deadline. So if you say no here, then we would have, I think it's 4 hours, believe it is, as I'm thinking about it, 4-hour window from the deadline that we could actually put these software updates into effect, and we'll randomize those across the clients, right? So the effect on a virtual machine host would be that, yeah, all the clients would get it, but it would be spread out over that random window, which would make it easier on the virtual machine host. All right, so that's one. So let's keep working our way down. Make sure there's nothing else in here. No. Okay, so move on down. So computer restarts definitely will impact us potentially for software updates. This is a generic setting. It's not just applying to software updates. Certainly does apply for software updates. So if you have a software update that needs to go out and reboot the system, and you tell it to go ahead and reboot the system, which I'll show you where you do that in a minute, then you're going to enter a 90-minute countdown based on this setting until the system forces the reboot. All right. So you can add more time, shorten that, whatever makes sense for you in this window, but that's where this is. And then down here under software updates, a couple of things to talk about. So first of all, whether or not software updates is enabled, right? The software update scan cycle, so how often we scan by default, once a week. Change that if you need to. Then this one, which I'll actually demonstrate to you, schedule deployment reevaluation. So what that means is if we have a software update that has deployed and you still have that software update applicable to the environment, if somehow that software update gets removed on a machine where it's targeted, then we will realize that when we do our scan once every 7 days, and we will go put it back, right? So be aware of that. Again, so you know what the behavior will be, but that's what the reevaluation does. Okay, and again, I'll show that to you in a minute how that works. And then finally, we get down here to this option. This is actually interesting. So one of the things that we're focusing on the client side is the user experience, right? So what we want to do as administrators in ConfigMgr is to certainly protect our environment by deploying software updates, but to do so in a way that minimizes the user's downtime and frustration with the process of applying updates. So what this option allows you to do, if you have deployments where the deadline for deployment 1 is tomorrow at 2 o'clock, but the deadline for deployment 2 is day after tomorrow at 2 o'clock, okay? By default, we're not going to force deploy those updates until we hit the deadline. Assuming no maintenance windows, they'll go ahead and apply at that deadline because that's what you've configured. So what that means is tomorrow at 2 o'clock, you'll have an update applied, potentially the system will reboot. Well, then day after tomorrow at 2 o'clock, you'll have another update applied, and the system again will potentially reboot. It'll be a nice, much nicer experience for the user if you say, okay, well, if we know tomorrow we're going to have a software update deadline hit. So why don't we look into the future and say any software update that is coming up for deployment, say 2 days from now, we want to go ahead and install that one at the same time. So what that does is it makes the user only be disrupted the one time instead of having to also stop the second day for the update, right? So that's a very valuable setting there as well. All right. Okay, so another setting that I want to talk to you about in the console that will have an impact on the user's experience is the idea of maintenance windows. Well, maintenance windows are again items that do not apply specifically to software updates, or do they? Right? Well, let's see. So let's pull in. Here's another of my lab servers that's actually running ConfigMgr 2012 R2. So prior to R2, a maintenance window equally applied to any kind of deployment in the environment. But after R2, we have made a change to maintenance windows where they only, or you can specify specific maintenance windows for software updates. So let me show you an example. So if I go into the properties of this collection I've set up for demo, and then go under maintenance windows, I can see that I have a maintenance windows I'm calling for software updates. If I double click on it, you can tell that this software update is only going, or this maintenance window only applies to software updates. Now, we have a few choices for where a maintenance window that you define can apply. So in this case, I'm setting a maintenance window specific to software updates. Again, that's new in ConfigMgr 2012 R2. So if that will help you in your environment to be able to carve out a different time for deploying software updates for certain types of systems or whatever. Now it's available to you as an option. And you can see there's one for task sequences too. So these maintenance windows, in the way they work, are no different, right? So you see that I have one from 1 to 4 a.m. here. And then I have on this other one a maintenance window defined. And it's, I think, from 6 to 8 a.m. Yeah, here. So just to close the gap on this, there's sometimes folks wonder, how can you tell what maintenance windows apply to my system? Well, the answer is there's a report that will help you do that. And the answer also is that if your system that you're targeting is in a collection that has a maintenance window on it, that system will get that maintenance window. So say you have one system in 2 collections like I have here, and both of these collections have maintenance windows, well, those maintenance windows will both apply to the system. So if I go to this report, I've just went ahead and ran it proactively. I have this option, maintenance windows available for the specified client. So you notice this one from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. and then this one from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. You see it duplicated here. The names, I'm not sure, I haven't dug into it as to why the names are duplicated. I'm guessing it's because I have 2 collections. The machine is in both collections and is inheriting both windows. But either way, you can use this report very easily to find out what your maintenance windows are. Okay? So cool. Let me pull this environment back out because I'm done with it. Don't need R2 for the rest of this. Okay. All right. Another component of software update deployment is Software Center. So we'll see Software Center here and see that there's some updates deployed, which we'll see in just a minute. But the thing I want to focus on right now is the idea of business hours. So we just talked about maintenance windows. Maintenance windows, as the name implies, are windows of time in which maintenance is possible on a machine. Well, business hours may seem very similar to maintenance windows at first. Talked about this whenever I did the application deployment series. It doesn't just apply to applications, it applies to all kinds of deployments to systems, right? So business hours are basically there for the user to have some ability to control their own experience. Okay, so let me give you a scenario first, then I'll walk you through a demo that I have here so you can kind of see what happens when the user works within their business hours. So consider the following scenario. Say that you have a software update deployment and you've set the deadline for a week from now. All right, it's going to be required at a week from now. And so that deployment goes out. The notifications alert the user that there is something pending for their machine. Well, they know, because it says so in the pop-up, that if they don't do anything, that they're going to get disrupted in a week. Well, maybe they don't want to be disrupted in a week, or maybe they know they're going to be on vacation and they don't want to be disrupted whenever they come back into the office. Or for whatever reason, they want to go ahead and install this software update now. So you have 2 choices. The user can either go ahead and install it now and then just get disrupted because the software update might reboot the computer, or they can acknowledge that they want to install the software update now, install the software update, but they don't want to do it right now because they're working. So they can say, go ahead and install, but do it after business hours. And so what will happen is the system will flag that update. Okay, you're no longer going to be required in a week. You're going to be required as soon as business hours are over today. And so then that, again, lets the update install sooner, but it gives the user some control of their experience to only have the update install when they're finished working for the day. Okay, the best way to show this is with an example. So If I go into available software, I see that I have an update deployed. So let me pull this down for a minute, and you'll see some of the software update deployments that I have here for demo purposes. So my software update group, this is going to be a required update. It's specifically with the business hours example. Right? So this is KB ends in 704. So if I come in here to my software center and look, this is the update 704, and it says this is scheduled to install basically several days from now. Right? If you look on my clock, currently it's the 18th, so I've got a little bit more than a week, not full 2 weeks, before this thing is required to install. Well, maybe I don't want to wait, again, for the reasons cited. Right? Well, this is already here, so I can't show you the pop-ups that will come as a result of this being here, but when this update becomes available, the user will be notified. And they will be able to click either in the systray, or you can schedule it here and get a pop-up that basically says, okay, go ahead and install it now. Just get it done. Right? Or I can schedule to install outside of my business hours that are defined. And I can also decide how I want the restart to be handled when I go ahead and install it. So just notice how this changes when I hit OK. It's going to go ahead and say, okay, waiting for the next available maintenance schedule. So what's happened behind the scenes is I've now moved this from being required on the 30th to being required today, but I'm respecting the business hours, and I'm going to start the installation when my business hours are over, so in this case at 10 o'clock. Then I'll be free to go ahead and start that software update installation. All right, so that's how that works. Okay. The other thing that sometimes comes up as a question is, you see in the Software Center we have available software, installation status, installed software, and so on. When you install software, it will show up as installed in Software Center. You might want to remove it. You might want to just know it's there, whatever. Software updates do not. Okay? If you look in this tab, when you have a bunch of software updates installed in your system through ConfigMgr, it's going to be blank. In fact, whenever you see me install some of these software updates in a minute, those software updates will basically remove themselves from Software Center so that I don't have any real action I can take on them. Just speculation on my part, but the whole reason why software updates are not intended to be removed. There are other places that you can go to see what software updates are on your system, like programs and features. Right? So since they're not intended to be removed once installed, we just take them away in Software Center. That's at least the way I think about it. Right? Again, that's my own interpretation of it, but it makes sense. Okay. Another thing on the client side, and then we'll move on to some examples, is understanding how data gets reported back to the site server. So whenever you deploy a software update, you're going to get status back on how that update went, the success, failure, stage, whatever, of how that software update deployment is going. Well, there's a couple of points here. The first point is that status about the software update comes up in what's called a state message. So state messages are uniquely used in those components that rely on the configuration item engine. So let's pause there for a minute. So in Configuration Manager 2007 for that matter, there are just a few components that rely on the Configuration Manager CI engine. Okay, so the application deployment model fully relies on state messages because it uses configuration items as its engine. Compliance settings is the base for all of the whole configuration item structure, so it uses configuration items and its status is reported back through state messages. Same way, software updates uses state messages because its whole infrastructure is based on configuration items. There's other places too, but state messages are different from status messages. When you have a status message that's sent up from something like a package deployment, that's sent up right away. As soon as that status message is written, it's sent up. And so you'll get fairly fairly real time, not exactly real time, but fairly realistic time frames for reporting for your packages and such. State messages are not sent that way. So the easiest way to show you is in the log. So let me go look at the state system log. It's a client log. Okay, so state message there. Okay, so what I want to do is look for a specific log entry. Let me search. State message manager received. That's probably enough. There it is. Right? Receive sent unsent notification. Well, let's look at this for a minute and follow it through. So I'm going to go find another instance of this. So notice the time, 9:01. So if I go down and search for it, the next one is at 9:16. Search again, and we're at 9:31 to the second. It's right there. So what happens is, as we work in state messages and send state messages, they are not sent real time. They are added to the client real time and stored there, but there's an up to a 15-minute delay from the time the state message is generated to the time it gets sent. So it may be a minute, could be 30 seconds from when the state message is written to when it's sent. It could be a full 15 minutes. So just factor that in whenever you start wondering, why am I delayed a little bit getting some of my status? It shouldn't be that big a deal, but just be aware of it. Another thing I'll show you real quick related to state messages that's new in 2012. At least I don't remember it being in 2007. If it was, I'm pretty certain it wasn't. In terms of deployment settings, so now we give you control over the detail that we send up related to state messages. You can do this on a deployment by deployment basis, and you can use the ConfigMgr 2007 style where you send everything up, or you can use the default, which is to send only success and error messages or just error messages, again to give you some control over how much traffic there is related to state messages in the system. So if you're accustomed to seeing certain things in a 2007 environment and they're not there in 2012, it could be because they're one of those messages that is not sent forward because of this new default setting. So just be aware of that. All right, so let's close out of here and then move on in our discussion a bit. Okay. So turning our attention to actual deployment. So there's a couple of different categories of deployments I want to show you. The first is some optional deployments, really one optional deployment, and then talk about required deployments, and then talk about what they look like. So to show that, let's bring the lab back in again and look through our next example. So there's probably not a whole lot new for some that will be seen here, but I just want to walk through some of the differences in different types of deployments, optional deployments versus required deployments, right? So to see it, let's start with this one. This is an optional deployment. Here's my deployment for it, and just look through some of the options here. So the first thing is, you see it's available. You see the scheduling. There's no big deal, nothing strange there. But here we go. So user notifications. So you'll notice that with an optional deployment, there is no ability to suppress totally user notifications. Why? Because the idea is anyway, and this reminds me of something else I want to show you. The idea is anyway that if you're going to deploy it optional, that you need a user to kick it off, right? Or maybe programmatically you're going to kick it off, whatever. So the user, if they're going to kick it off, at least needs to be notified that it's there, right? So that's definitely a difference. One thing, so I mentioned the programmatic, the rest of it's nothing I want to talk about right now. I mentioned the programmatic capability. So let me show you this one thing too that I actually did overlook. So if I go to client settings and look at computer agent, I believe it is. Let's see here. Yeah, here it is staring me right in the face. Notice this option. Additional software manages the deployment of applications and software updates. This is set to no, right? So by default, we don't expect any other software to be involved in the deployment process of our applications or software updates. But there could be. So there are some partner solutions that are out there, and there might be other reasons that some kind of other product would control the actual deployment of the software updates. If that's true, you can set this to yes. Well, it also is an interesting option to consider anyway whenever you're doing scripting. Maybe if you're trying to kick off some of these things manually, in that case, kind of in a very real sense, you would be using other software, your code, to kick these things off. Just understand the implications of this before you change it. It's usually not something you'd want to mess with, but at least we give you the control there. Okay. Before I show you this, so one other interesting discussion that I had with a customer not too long ago was they were actually asking if it was possible to deploy software updates to users. And their thought behind it was if we could put it in the user, if we could deploy it to users, it would show up in the web catalog. And then when a help desk technician or a field technician or whoever were to log into the system, they would have all of the software updates available to them, and they could pick and choose those that need to be deployed and bring the system up to date or whatever. That's a good thought. The software updates, if they're not applicable, they will just be bypassed. You won't need to run them. So trying to run these things out of the application catalog where everything shows up and many things might not apply to the system, a little bit messy, right? But it's a moot point because there's no ability to deploy software updates to the user. Let's go back in here and I'll show you. So if I wanted to, I'll just do another quick deployment to it just to show it. If I wanted, I can't even focus on the user. So look, here I just have device collections. There's no ability to have user collections at all, so it's a moot issue. Okay? So let's go through and deploy this thing to the user. Again, nothing fancy about this. You've seen these deployments before, so you probably can anticipate what's going to happen. But here's 702. I think it was 702 up here. Wrong window. There we go, 702. I'll just go ahead and pull the install trigger, and it'll go through and waiting for the install, downloading the update to be installed, and it's rolling along here. Taking a minute, you'll see it install and roll over to finished. And now we're done. Requires restart. Right? So 702 now requires restart. There's another one in here waiting for restart. So I'll probably reboot the system in just a minute, and we'll see that. Right? Okay, so nothing fancy there. You saw the notification, saw how it works. We'll trace that whole process in the logs in our next session, but for now we'll leave it there. Yeah. So the next one that I want to talk about is required deployment. So again, nothing fancy here except to show you just a few of the settings. So this one will be required, and this one currently is not enabled. I haven't got this deployed at all, so I'm going to go ahead and enable it so it can start to work its way through the system. It's required, so my hope is as we're rolling through here, I'll check policy in a minute, and you'll see policy come down and the whole process end to end about how this works. But while I'm in the deployment here, we do have the option to hide everything from Software Center. There's a couple of other options I'll talk about. So we do have the option to totally hide, right? Also, these definitions for deadline behavior. When the deadline is reached, what do I want to do? Do I want to go ahead and start the software update installation? In this case, yes, I'm going to go ahead and do it. So if I'm in a maintenance window and the deadline is arrives while I'm in that window, then I'm going to go ahead and allow that software update to install. I'm sorry, back up. Said that wrong. If I am not in a maintenance window, but the deadline to install that software update arrives, I'm going to go ahead and allow that installation to happen even though I'm not in a maintenance window. But notice I also have controls over the restart. So if I'm not in a maintenance window, then I don't want this system to restart. So I'm going to leave that blank. Right? Well, this is interesting because you'll actually see some notifications about the restart even though you're not in a maintenance window. If you want to totally suppress the restart, then you need to do it down here. So for this option, if I allow the install and the update requires a restart, but I don't have this turned on, it's going to give me a pop-up that says, hey, this needs to be restarted, and keep nagging me about it. Or if I tell it go ahead and restart, it's going to immediately enter into a 90-minute countdown, like you saw on the client settings, waiting for that restart. Right? So again, factor those into how your experience needs to be, and we give you a lot of controls for that. So let me go ahead and launch the control panel applet and kick off policy. If I can get that to stick, there we go. So it should be there by now. Let's kick the action. And there we go. So software changes are required. Here we go. You can tell that this is installing. This is in fact the update that I pushed out, 194. And you see that it's requiring a restart. And you also see here that recently installed apps require it. I'm going to open the restart window. And because I did not allow restart, it's not going to force it. It's going to give me this option, and it's going to continue to nag me or snooze based on what I want here for however long, up to 4 hours. Right? So again, nothing probably really hugely new here than what you've seen, but interesting nonetheless. So let me, I'm going to pause the video real quick and go ahead and reboot this system because it needs it, clear a couple of those updates, and I'll come back in just a moment. Okay, so back from reboot, so let's continue on. So in the category of advanced deployments, a couple of things that I want to show here. So the first is the deployment reevaluation cycle. We've talked about that, and I want to do the deadline randomization we've talked about, so there's really nothing to show there. I also want to show install from internet. Those are the two final demos. We'll talk about script to trigger update installation as we close out. But let's talk about deployment reevaluation for a minute. So I mentioned what that was, that if an update has been deployed and for some reason that update gets removed, that we'll have this reevaluation cycle that every 7 days we'll go out and check. By default, you can change that. We'll go out and check for any updates that are not there but are still deployed. And if they're not there, we'll go ahead and deploy them again. Right? Or you can just trigger the action in the control panel applet, and it will go ahead and initiate that. So let me show you an example of that real quick. So this update is one that I sent out. This is required. It's for my deployment reevaluation. It's update 289. So that's already deployed. That's the one you saw me deploy last. Or sorry, one of those that was sitting there waiting for a reboot before I rebooted. So let me go back in and look at control panel, and we'll look at it, verify it's there. So 289, we'll go to programs and features, look at view installed updates, go to 289. First of all, look at what was installed today. So 1018 right here. Here's software update 289. So as far as ConfigMgr is concerned, go ahead and open up Software Center. If I can do this mouse magic here. So as far as ConfigMgr is concerned, this update is installed. There's nothing else to do with it. None of these are 289. You have a 704, a 632, but none of them. We don't see this thing anywhere in here. No installed software, nothing, right? So as far as ConfigMgr is concerned, this is ready to go. So I'm going to go and uninstall it. So here's 289. I'm going to uninstall. Theoretically, this should not require a reboot. Oh, it says it does. So let me reboot the machine, and I will come back and we'll start this thing again. Okay, so back from a reboot, and now everything's cleared. That update that I just removed is still removed. So what I need to do is just go ahead and force what would normally happen anyway and do a software updates deployment and evaluation cycle. We'll go ahead and run that now. And we'll see, hey, there's new software available. We know that, right? It's right here. It's available. Not required yet, but here in just a minute, you should see that we'll detect, in fact, there it is. Past due will be retried. So we detect that, in fact, that is still needed, and we're going to go ahead and force it back on as soon as we can. All right, so we'll let that cook for a bit. and so on. But that's how it works, right? Well, there's one more thing that I want to show you, and that is if we go back to the console and go back into software library, software updates, software update groups. There's a software update group that I have here that is optional, right? It's 632, KB 632. So if I go in here, the one that's still available down here is 632. And what I want to show with this is the new ability we have. This is not R2, this is SP1. That if you have a software update deployment that your client knows about and needs to install, but for whatever reason the client is not able to get to that software update in your infrastructure, maybe the client PC is in a hotel room or traveling or somewhere, then you have the ability to allow that client PC to go download that update that you've deemed needed from Microsoft Updates. So what that doesn't mean is that we'll get everything from Microsoft Updates, just those things that you approve. So the way you do that is on the deployment, the last tab down here, you have this option that says if the software update's not available on the preferred DPs or remote DPs, then go get it from Microsoft Updates. So we're always going to prefer your infrastructure. But if by chance we can't get there, we'll go to Microsoft Updates if you allow for this. So notice in this deployment I have a red X on the software update group. What that means is the software update in my software update group is not on any distribution point. It's right here. So that's a good indicator to let you know, hey, there's something up with this. But if you set that option for downloading from the internet, you can still do it. So let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to have to turn on the internet NIC on this real quick just to show you. So here's my control panel. Let me go to network and sharing. I don't leave this usually on the internet. I'm going to enable this. Okay, and then minimize. Come back to it in a minute. Minimize. Alright, and then the other thing I'm going to do, because I have previously downloaded this, I'm going to get rid of it in the cache folder. So here's CCM. Oops. Here's what I want. So all of this is cache content. I'm just going to rip it out, which is going to cause this to fail, generally the first time. But let's see what it does. So let's see. Okay, so let's go back to Software Center. And now I'm going to try to kick this off. Install. So off it goes, and it failed, just like I thought it would. So let's try it again. Retry. And now downloading 0% and waiting to install, and it works, right? But this was not on any distribution point. The way I can prove that is going into the logs. It's in a couple of places, but the one I'll look at is under logs here, and specifically I want to look in Content Transfer Manager. Content Transfer Manager here, and I'm just going to search up for the string that I know is already going to be there. So search up for http://wsus.ds. That should be enough. Search up, and sure enough, we find it. So we know by this location that we're downloading from that we pulled this from the internet. Right? There's a data transfer service job here that's starting the download from the internet. So as easy as that, I know it went to the internet. The user experience, they don't know the difference, right? And it's only pulling those that you've approved to be pulled, but nonetheless, it works very effectively, right? Okay, so and that's really it. The only other thing I really want to talk about while I'm here is, so I mentioned, I alluded to the option that you might want to take sometimes to be able to control software updates remotely, software updates programmatically. And that's certainly possible. So there's all sorts of options, for example, for you to be able to go and trigger a software update deployment and evaluation cycle. So that's great for any software updates that are actively deployed, that are required, that kind of thing that you're scanning for, whatever. But there could be those that maybe you want to deploy as optional, and maybe have some script that goes and kicks these off. Whatever the scenario, there could be many. It would be nice to have a script that could go out to the client and kick off software updates. And there is one, and there's several ways you could do it. It could be WMI methods that you could call, it could be PowerShell, could be VB script. I'll show you one that one of my colleagues put together and published up here. It's from Saud, and it shows how to install all missing updates using ConfigMgr. Oops, that just went away. Let me get that back. There we go. And it's just a simple PowerShell script, but it's really interesting from the perspective that it uses the APIs, gives you some good examples with PowerShell, and is here. So this is the URL. Let me just put this up here in case you're interested. Let's minimize this again. Go back in here, and I'll put up Notepad and put that in there. So that's the full URL, if interested, right? So pull that over. Okay. So that's really it for this session. So for the next session, we're going to go do a bit more deep dive, tracing a deployment, one deployment, I don't know, whatever we have time for, maybe two. But in the next session, we'll take the same approach, likely take an optional software update, walk through the process, see it in the logs, exactly how it deploys. Again, all with the intention and mind toward trying to help know when things go wrong and where to go look for troubleshooting and so on. So we'll wrap it for now. We'll see you in the next session.